The biggest mistake people make when writing female characters is making them too reliant on the male leads. If you've been struggling to write strong female heroines and meaningful side characters, then you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how you can write women that captivate your reader, affect the plot in a meaningful way, and how you can avoid all of the common pitfalls that female characters usually fall into. And the very first step is to give them agency. Now, the best way to think about agency is to think about independence and independent decisions that your females are making. Oftentimes, female characters are hyper-reliant on the male characters. Some of the ways that you might see this is that the male characters are taking away the female character's agency, or they're influencing their decisions to the point where even if the female character wanted to make a different decision, she doesn't. And women should be allowed to make their own decisions, even if it's going to create problems for them later. And this is so important that we're going to talk about it in more detail later on in the video, so be sure you keep watching. I really want to challenge you to think about how you might be taking agency away from your female characters. One book that I saw this a lot in, or book series I guess, was The Bonds That Tie. And I'm probably going to be referencing this series a lot because in the first book, Oleander Fallows is actually really well written, and then at the very end of the first book she gets her gift, and that inevitably takes away all of the things that made her a good female character. This next one is a little bit more specific to male authors, but women are more than their emotions and their physical appearances. If you're referencing the physical appearance, you should keep it relevant. And one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about this, especially if you're writing a male protagonist, is the unreliable narrator. If you want to know more about the unreliable narrator, then definitely like this video, because if it gets 5 likes, I'll make a video all about the unreliable narrator. But in this instance, the thing that you need to keep in mind is that your male lead has certain needs that may influence what he notices. And so, yes, he might take more note of her physical appearance, but as you develop the relationships between the characters, you want to focus on other things than just their physical appearance. So just make sure you're keeping these descriptions relevant to the story and only talking about what really matters, keeping in mind what would matter to your character. Hopefully that makes sense and it's not super convoluted. If it is, I apologize. When you're writing females, be very careful about overdoing their emotions. You have to kind of find a balance between making them more emotional than your male characters, but in a way that's not over the top and over dramatic. One book that you see this in is The Duke and I, and that's because Daphne's mother gets sort of dramatically emotional quite often, but it's done in a way that it's entertaining and it's clearly to create humor for the reader more than anything else. So that's a spot where it's done very well, but it's very easy to just focus on giving them dramatic emotions and focusing only on their appearance and not really keeping in mind what actually makes the character. Another great way to differentiate female characters is by giving them masculine traits. And there are so many masculine traits to choose from. If you look at The Last of Us, specifically the video game, because I know that the TV show doesn't do it right, the character Abby is a soldier. She's sort of the opposite of everything that Ellie is, right? Ellie is small and stealthy, whereas in contrast, Abby has a very big frame and, one of her weapons I think is a grenade launcher, and she's sort of in this role as a character to be a top soldier for the enemies that go and kill Joel. Other ways you could write this is maybe by making your female character blunt and insensitive. Maybe she talks before she thinks, or is more likely to keep her emotions to herself. So there's lots of ways that you can blend masculine traits with your actual female characters to make them more interesting and to give them more substance. Now, one of my favorite ways to make female characters more interesting is by giving them hobbies. And this really just depends on your novel. When you're writing historical fiction, some of the best hobbies you can give characters need to be historically accurate, of course. So things like embroidery and needlework or sewing or cooking, just give them something to enjoy that isn't just interacting with the masculine characters and the male leads. More contemporary literature often focuses a lot on like university life and putting the characters in the university. So studying does count as a hobby. And the way that you want to use the hobbies that you give your characters is to sort of take us away from the social interactions with the male leads and give us some more introspection into the female character and what she wants. Giving her these hobbies is a great way to create more intimate time with your characters. Another thing that we're going to talk about a little bit later is female friends, and these are some great opportunities to let us see how she interacts with her friends and to actually give her that time with her friends. So now earlier I mentioned that we were going to talk about giving the characters challenges, and this is really specific for avoiding the classic archetype of the Mary Sue. The main purpose of the challenge is to give characters an opportunity to fail, and your characters should fail. And I want to kind of warn you against one thing, because there is a point where you're sort of trying too hard, and so by trying too hard you're giving all of these situations that are like reverse Mary Sue's. And I was reading Broken Bond specifically, nobody likes Oleander Fallows. Like, nobody does. To the point where the only person she gets really any sympathy from is Sage and Atlas. And there's just a point where that's too much. And to me, that's really obvious in trying not to have a Mary Sue character. To some extent, that is what makes the first book the best one in the series, because after Oleander gets her gift, things become a lot easier for her, and it's just plot devices that are preventing her from just killing the bad guy.
Future Kiana here. I sort of rambled without really making a point, so I wanted to really quickly address this because it's important. Ultimately, what happens after Oleander gets her gift is that the gift removes her challenges, and instead of adding challenges that match her new power, the author just uses the plot to prevent her from accomplishing her goals. So it's not really the same as having challenges. And yes, there are situations that create challenges, but they're not really challenges that challenge the character, they're challenges that challenge the society. For example, when North moves everyone into the sanctuary, they have to start building the sanctuary and there's not enough housing for anyone. But on the other hand, Oleander doesn't have to live in a shack because she's part of the Draven Bond and they have all the money, so they have their own private house when most of the other people have to share houses. And the only thing that's keeping her from defeating the enemy is that she's not powerful enough and she needs to bond in order to get those powers. But the only character that really has any difficulties to bond with is Nox, so she ends up not really having any challenges and just sort of plot devices that conveniently stop her from ending the story, and that goes on for 5 books, which is a little bit annoying to read. But the first book is great.
Now, I know I said I would get back to this, so here we are. The next thing I want to talk about is giving your female leads female friends. And this is actually a great way to create agency for the character and give them independence outside of their relationships. The other thing is when you're trying to build a relationship, you're often putting up walls and creating boundaries, and you're not totally yourself. Giving your female characters female friends is a great way to give them an opportunity to show their true colors and show who they really are, and like just have someone to vent with and be real with. So it's a great way to help pace your novel, as well as do some of the other things that I've recommended in this video. That being said, your female friends should be relevant to the plot. Don't just add them in because I'm telling you that you need one. So just make sure that you're being wary of that. And now we can talk about writing good romances specifically. I feel like this topic kind of needs its own video, so I'll be really quick here. Let me know in the comments what questions you have specifically for writing romances so that I can address them in the future video. But the main point here for your female character is that she should not need to rely on a man in every situation. And this goes back to creating agency. You'll see a lot of these points are kind of tied together, but some ways that you could show this is just by showing us her thought process, or maybe if we've established that she's sort of impulsive, maybe she goes off and does impulsive things that, ends up irritating the male leads, but because they love her, they have to kind of follow her anyway. If you're writing a character that is Miss-Independent, then the most important thing to keep in mind for this particular aspect is sort of the opposite. She needs to learn how to rely on others. So you could create opportunities for Miss-Independence to get into trouble. Maybe she hurts her leg doing something impulsive or trying to do something on her own, and then has to learn how to rely on others to help her, and that's really hard for her. The other thing, and this is just something that really bothers bothers me about contemporary romantasy that I've read, but love interests shouldn't slave over their women immediately. There has to be an actual romance established. It can't just be like, oh, we're destined to be together and now I'm going to do everything that you want. So be sure that you're building the romance and making the romance meaningful. Now, I find when I'm writing my first draft that I tend to be really inspired by certain tropes or archetypes, and this is okay for your first draft. But generally speaking, as you develop your draft and as you edit and make changes, your characters need to become more fleshed out and they need to move away from those stereotyped tropes. Otherwise, it's sort of predictable. It's a little bit boring to read because the reader knows what to expect. Like, oh, this is just another horny werewolf archetype, or oh, this is just another broody vampire archetype. Like, you need to kind of edit out the archetypes while still keeping them what you want. So some great ways that you could do this is by just slightly changing the archetype. You know, you could pick one thing that's very stereotypical to that archetype and then change it, as long as you're not, you know, making your vampire sparkle and turning them into something that's not a vampire. They should still follow vampire rules, okay? We're not going to talk about that because I'll go on a huge tangent about how Twilight is not vampires. On that note, I would love to hear what some of your favorite archetypes are, so definitely tell me in the comments. Or what are some of the archetypes that you're just sick of seeing in contemporary literature? I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me all about it. Now, this last little bit is just kind of touching on things I already talked about, but I think that these tips are really important. Breaking these rules can be okay when it's necessary to the plot. So earlier when I was talking about female friends, you specifically don't want to just add female friends to just do it. And one of the best examples of this is in The Duke and I. Daphne doesn't actually have any female friends because frankly they're not necessary to the plot. Now, I think it would be really interesting if you saw Daphne interacting with some of the other women, but we don't really see that and we don't need that for the plot. And in fact, you only see this in the little like blurb at the end that the author added to the Bridgerton novel edition, where she has at that point developed a friendship with Penelope Featherington, but you don't see that friendship develop in the actual book because the only thing that's relevant to the plot is the relationship with Simon. However, you do see Daphne's interactions with her family, and the reason that these interactions are important is because they develop Daphne's character. The primary point of these interactions is to show that Daphne's family is not a typical Viscountess family. It's crazy and not everyone practices proper decorum. And you know, there's a pea that flies over Violet Bridgerton's head in the middle of their dinner. And then later it's also used to develop Daphne's excitement about wanting children, which is the core conflict that develops later on in the book. So that's why those familial interactions are important, whereas having a friend is not that important. The other thing to keep in mind is that these details are really rather small scenes, like the part where Daphne says you could be a really good father after he interacts with Hyacinth Bridgerton because she wants to jump in the puddles. When you add in unnecessary characters, it's really obvious, especially when you're editing, because those scenes just don't really add anything. And I noticed that a lot of those scenes tend to be places where I'm just kind of world building and like thought dumping and just regurgitating information into the reader in a way that's not really natural. I did this with my mentor character, and I realized as I thought about it that that character is really sort of already developed. I'd love to hear what kind of characters you're developing and how you're developing your female characters and what ways that you're going to change those characters. And if you want to develop your writing even further, then check out the video on the screen which covers the 5 most common writing mistakes that beginner authors make.